Some lands carry more than dust and forgotten memories. Thomas Mitchell watched the barn before him, its time-worn planks telling stories no one else cared to hear. The westerly wind blew through the cracks in the wood, producing a low, melancholy sound that echoed across the empty plain. There was something peculiar about the way the realtor lowered his eyes when he mentioned the price. $1. Just $1 for 30 acres of land and a building that still stood after decades. The man from the big city had arrived at Cedar Ridge 3 days earlier, fleeing a life that no longer made sense. His fine leather shoes contrasted with the red earth that stuck to everything around. The townspeople greeted him with forced courtesy, but there was something about the looks he couldn't decipher, a silent caution, as if they were keeping a secret that weighed on the shoulders of the entire community. During the afternoon, Thomas walked around the property. The main barn dominated the landscape, but there were other, smaller structures scattered around the grounds. An old well, with stones arranged in a perfect circle, a low stone fence that did not follow any logical pattern to delimit pasture or plantation, and strange marks carved into some trees, symbols he couldn't understand. The silence of the place was deep, but not empty. It was as if the earth itself was breathing slowly, guarding secrets buried long ago. Thomas felt the eyes of the city upon him whenever he walked the streets. The merchants were polite, but their conversations died when he approached. The children played normally until they noticed his presence, then ran into the house. At the local tavern, he tried to strike up a conversation with some villagers. The bartender, a stout man with scars on his hands, poured his drink, no questions asked. When Thomas mentioned buying the old Henderson ranch, the establishment fell silent. All faces turned to him, charged with an expression that mixed pity and concern. An old farmer approached the table. His hands trembled slightly as he placed his hat on his chest. He spoke in a low voice, almost in a whisper, about how the Henderson family had left overnight, leaving everything behind. He mentioned disturbing dreams and strange happenings, but when Thomas asked for more details, the man shook his head and walked away. During the first night on the property, Thomas lit a fire near the barn. The stars shone brightly in the clear desert sky, but the feeling of being watched did not leave him. The wind carried sounds that he could not identify, rhythmic beats, as if someone were working wood somewhere far away. Or maybe it was just his imagination, fueled by the half-told stories he had heard in the city. He decided to explore the barn the next morning. The main door was locked with a thick chain, but it found a side entrance half hidden by loose boards. The interior was better preserved than he expected. Old tools hung from the walls, covered in a thin layer of red dust. There were wooden chests piled up in one corner, and something that looked like a makeshift altar made of smooth stones. It was then that he noticed the marks on the floor, concentric circles engraved on the beaten earth with unknown symbols distributed around it. In the center, the earth appeared to have been removed and replaced recently. Someone had buried something there, and Thomas had a feeling that finding out what it was would change everything about his new life in that quiet land. The afternoon breeze brought a strange aroma. It wasn't the typical smell of old wood or dry earth. It was something deeper, older, as if the very history of the place was impregnated in the walls of the barn, waiting for someone brave enough to come and unearth the truth that the residents of Cedar Ridge would rather forget. Thomas woke up before dawn, driven by a restlessness he couldn't explain. The rummaged earth in the center of the barn had populated his dreams all night. He picked up an old shovel he found among the tools and decided to find out what the Hendersons had left behind. The first ray of sunlight was passing through the cracks in the wood when he began to dig. The land gave way easily, as if it had been disturbed many times before. With each swoop, his curiosity grew along with a strange feeling that he was violating something sacred. Sweat dripped down his face as the hole deepened, revealing layers of earth with different colors. The shovel hit something solid after almost an hour of work. Thomas knelt down and began to remove the dirt with his hands. His fingers touched a thick fabric, like long-tanned leather. He pulled carefully and emerged from the earth a heavy bundle, tied with ropes that seemed to be made of vegetable fibers. His hands trembled as he undid the knots. The fabric opened, revealing objects that took his breath away. A necklace made of polished stone beads and small carved bones formed intricate designs that pulsated with meaning he did not understand. Next to it, wooden masks painted with earthy pigments showed faces that seemed to hold the wisdom of generations. There were more items buried there. Small stone figurines depicting desert animals, ceramic pots with engraved symbols that matched the marks he had seen on the trees, and a ceremonial staff decorated with feathers and colored stones that reflected the morning light like small suns. Thomas sat on the dirt floor, surrounded by the objects he had just discovered. The feeling of holding something deeply sacred made him uncomfortable. These were not treasures hidden by settlers or bandits. They were ceremonial items of a people who had lived in these lands long before the first white men arrived in the West. He began to understand why the residents of Cedar Ridge looked at him with such a mixture of pity and apprehension. The Henderson family had not simply abandoned the property. They had discovered these objects and for some reason decided it was better to leave than to deal with the aftermath of their discovery. The sun was higher when he decided to look for more information in the city. He carefully wrapped the objects and stored them in a chest in the barn. On the way to Cedar Ridge, he noticed how the wind seemed to whisper through the desert bushes, as if the land itself was trying to tell him a story. In the city library, a small but well-organized building, he found the librarian, a gray-haired lady who greeted him with a cautious smile. Thomas asked about the history of the area, specifically the native people who had lived there before the settlers arrived. The woman hesitated before answering. He told of a tribe that had inhabited these lands for hundreds of years, living in harmony with the arid environment. They were known for their elaborate ceremonies and deep spiritual connection to the land. When the first ranchers arrived, there were conflicts, but also periods of peace and cooperation. Thomas asked what had happened to this tribe. The librarian lowered her voice and said that they were forced to move to a distant reservation during one of the many conflicts that marked the westward expansion. Many sacred objects were lost or hidden during this turbulent time. She looked him straight in the eye and asked if he had found anything strange on her property. Thomas felt that she knew more than she was willing to reveal. He replied that he was just curious about the history of the place, but her expression showed that he had not been convincing. Back at the ranch, Thomas contemplated the objects scattered on a makeshift table in the barn. The evening light made the stones and metals shine with an intensity that seemed otherworldly. I had the feeling that these items were not just historical artifacts. They were pieces of a living culture with meanings and power that transcended their understanding. The night came bringing more vivid dreams. He saw painted faces dancing around campfires. He heard songs in a language he did not know, but that he somehow understood. He woke up with the certainty that he needed to do something with his discovery. Keeping these objects buried didn't seem right, but I also didn't know what the right attitude would be. The night wind swayed the loose planks of the barn, producing a low melody that sounded almost like a lament. Thomas was under the impression that the land around him was waiting for a decision that would change not only his life, but perhaps the fate of something much bigger and older than he could have imagined. Dawn brought an unexpected discovery. Thomas woke up to find footprints around the barn. They were not his, nor did they look like any animal he knew. The markings on the earth showed bare feet, with long toes adapted to walking in the desert. Someone had been there during the night, observing his property. He followed the footprints that led toward the rocky hills on the horizon. The trail disappeared into the stones, but Thomas noticed small signs left on purpose. One stone stacked on top of another in specific places. Broken branches pointing in a certain direction. It was as if someone was trying to guide him without showing himself directly. In the city, he decided to look for the priest of the small local church. The man was elderly, with deep wrinkles marked by the desert sun. His blue eyes carried the wisdom of someone who had witnessed many stories over the years. Thomas told of his discovery, choosing words carefully. The priest listened in silence, his hands clasped over a worn-out Bible. When Thomas finished, the man sighed deeply. He said he knew the history of lost sacred objects well. The local tribe had entrusted these items to the Hendersons years earlier, when government pressure threatened to confiscate everything they considered pagan relics. The family had promised to keep the objects until it was safe to return them, but the weight of responsibility and the strange events that began to occur frightened them. They left one morning, leaving only a note saying that the objects were safe and that someone worthy would eventually find them. The priest revealed that some members of the tribe still lived in the region, although they had officially been relocated decades earlier. They kept their distance from the city, living according to ancient traditions in the remotest lands of the desert. He knew because they sometimes came in search of medical help or basic supplies. Thomas asked how he could find them. The priest smiled for the first time during the conversation. He said that if the objects had really been discovered, they already knew. The spiritual connection with these items was so strong that they could feel it even from a distance. The footprints around the barn were proof of this. Back at the ranch, Thomas examined more carefully the signs left during the night. Now that he knew what to look for, he could make out a pattern. The stacked stones formed a trail that stretched across the hills. He decided to follow the path, taking with him only water and some of the smaller objects in a leather bag. The walk lasted almost the entire day. The desert sun was relentless, but Thomas felt a strange energy guiding his steps. The signals took him through narrow canyons and cactus-covered plains to an area where rocks formed impressive natural formations. It was there that he saw the first bonfire in the distance. Fine smoke rose straight in the still afternoon air. As he got closer, he made out human silhouettes moving around the fire. Her heart raced, mixing nervousness and anticipation. A man detached himself from the group and walked towards them. He was tall and thin, with long hair held back by a leather band. His skin was sunburned, and his eyes were deep as wells of ancient wisdom. He wore simple clothes, but he carried a dignity that Thomas immediately recognized. The man introduced himself as Joseph Golden Eagle. His voice was low and soothing, like the whisper of the wind among the stones. He spoke in English, but with an accent that revealed that it was not his native language. He said that they had felt the awakening of the sacred objects and knew that someone special had found them. Thomas opened his bag and showed the items he had brought. Joseph's eyes lit up with deep emotion. He played each piece reverently, muttering words in his native language. He explained that these objects belonged to important ceremonies of his people, rituals that connected the living with their ancestors and with the land itself. Other members of the tribe approached. There were men and women of different ages, but they all shared the same expression of respect when they saw the objects. An elderly woman, with snow-white hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the history of the desert, touched Thomas's forehead in a gesture of thanks. Joseph explained that they had given up hope of ever recovering these treasures. The forced dispersal of his people had torn families apart and broken traditions that had existed for generations. Seeing the objects again was like reconnecting with a part of their souls that had been lost. Thomas felt a weight build up in his chest. He realized that he was facing something much bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't just about returning lost objects. It was about healing wounds that had been open for decades and restoring the dignity of a people who had been forced to abandon their homeland. Night was falling over the wilderness when Joseph invited him to share the meal with them. The fire crackled softly as stories were told in low voices. Thomas listened, absorbing every word, feeling that his life had taken a turn he could never have imagined when he decided to buy an abandoned barn for $1. Thomas spent 3 days with the tribe, learning about each object and its sacred significance. Joseph Golden Eagle became not only a guide, but a true friend. The native man shared ancient stories as they walked the desert trails, teaching Thomas to read the signs of nature that had always been there, waiting to be understood. The elderly woman, who was named Maria Crescent Moon, showed Thomas how each mask represented a different protective spirit. The ceremonial necklace had belonged to the tribe's last great spiritual leader, a man who could converse with the winds and predict rainy seasons. The stone figurines were sacred guardians, each responsible for protecting an aspect of tribal life. When it came time to return to the ranch, Thomas carried more than the objects in his bag. He brought with him a new understanding of the value of traditions and the importance of preserving the memory of a people. Joseph accompanied him part of the way, helping to transport the larger items with the care of one who wields priceless treasures. In the barn, they organized all the objects on blankets woven by the tribe itself. The sight was impressive. Each piece glowed with an almost visible energy, as if they were happy to finally be reunited again. Joseph performed a brief purification ceremony, burning sacred herbs and murmuring prayers in his ancestral language. During the next few days, other members of the tribe began to visit the ranch. They came in small groups, always respectful and silent. They brought simple offerings, hand-woven baskets, polished stones found in special places, carefully harvested medicinal plants. Thomas realized that he was being accepted not only as a custodian of the objects, but as part of a larger community. The change in his life did not go unnoticed by the residents of Cedar Ridge. The constant visits of native people to his property generated comments in the city. Some were curious, others were worried. The sheriff, a burly man with a grey mustache, showed up at the ranch on a hot afternoon to ask questions. Thomas received the officer with cordiality, offering fresh water and a place in the shade. The sheriff asked about the unusual activities on his property. There were rumors that valuable artifacts had been discovered, and some people were concerned about possible illegal excavations or disturbance of archaeological sites. Carefully, Thomas explained that he had found objects that belonged to the local native people and was working to return them to the appropriate community. He showed some items to the sheriff, explaining their cultural and historical importance. The officer examined the pieces with genuine interest, admitting that he had never seen anything like it. The sheriff revealed that he had received pressure from some state authorities to investigate suspicious activity in the region. Strict laws existed regarding the ownership and marketing of native artifacts, and any significant discovery had to be reported to the relevant agencies. Thomas felt butterflies in his stomach, realizing that his situation could quickly get complicated. Joseph showed up at the ranch that same afternoon, as if he knew instinctively that his presence was necessary. The sheriff was still there, examining some documents Thomas had obtained from the library about the history of the estate. The tension in the air was palpable as the two men greeted each other. To Thomas's surprise, Joseph and the sheriff knew each other. They had worked together years earlier, when land issues involving native rights had arisen in the region. The officer showed genuine respect for the tribal leader, and his attitude changed noticeably when Joseph explained the situation of the sacred objects. Joseph told the sheriff about the long-standing agreement with the Henderson family and how the objects had been protected all these years. He explained that the tribe had no interest in selling or trading the items. They just wanted to recover their sacred relics so they could perform important ceremonies that had been interrupted for decades. The sheriff listened intently, occasionally asking questions about legal procedures and necessary documentation. Joseph showed some old papers he had kept, including correspondence with government officials about the tribe's relocation and the issue of cultural objects. The conversation lasted for hours, but gradually the atmosphere became more friendly. As the sun began to set, the sheriff got up to leave. He shook hands with Thomas and Joseph, saying that he would make a positive report on the situation. He mentioned that he knew of some lawyers specializing in native rights who could help formalize the return of the objects in a legal and appropriate manner. That night, Thomas and Joseph sat by the barn, watching the stars shine in the clear desert sky. Joseph spoke about how things had changed over the years, but how some truths remained constant. The land always remembered those who treated it with respect, and sacred objects always found their way back to where they belonged. Thomas felt that his journey was reaching a point of transformation. The man in the big city who had bought an abandoned barn for $1 was becoming something different. A guardian, a friend, a bridge between two worlds that had long been separated by misunderstandings and fear. He bought an old barn for $1 and then discovered what no neighbor dared to mention, Part 5. Final 3 weeks later, the barn that Thomas had bought for $1 turned into the scene of something extraordinary. Members of the tribe arrived since dawn from different directions of the desert, some traveling for days to be present. They wore drums made of tanned leather, carved wooden flutes, and ceremonial robes carefully guarded for generations. Maria Lua Crescent had insisted that the return ceremony take place at the place where the objects were found. According to her, the land needed to witness the return of the sacred guardians to its people. Thomas watched the preparations with a mixture of emotion and responsibility that he had never felt before. Joseph Golden Eagle arranged the objects on a circular rug, woven especially for the occasion. Each item was placed in a specific position, following a pattern that represented the wheel of life and the cycles of nature. The masks facing the 4 cardinal points, the ceremonial necklace in the center, the figurines forming a protective circle around it. The sheriff arrived accompanied by the lawyer specializing in native rights that he had mentioned. They brought official documents that formalized the return and guaranteed that the objects would remain in the legal custody of the tribe. Thomas signed the papers with pride, knowing he was doing the right thing. To his surprise, some Cedar Ridge residents also showed up. The priest was there, as well as the librarian and some local merchants. They came with respectful curiosity, many bringing small gifts as a symbol of reconciliation. Thomas realized that his decision had begun to change the relationship between the city and the native people. When the sun reached its highest point, Maria Lua Crescent began the ceremony. Her ancient voice echoed through the barn as she sang in her native language, words that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of tradition. Other members of the tribe joined in the singing, creating a harmony that made the old planks of the barn vibrate gently. Joseph approached Thomas and placed a hand on his shoulder. In a low voice, he explained that the tribe had decided to give him a name in their language, Listening Heart. It was an honor reserved for people who demonstrated a genuine ability to understand and respect traditions different from their own. During the ceremony, each object was individually blessed and given to the tribe's designated guardians. The ceremonial necklace was entrusted to a young man who was being groomed to become the next spiritual leader. The masks were distributed among the elders responsible for different aspects of the sacred traditions. Thomas watched everything with a full heart. I had started that journey by running away from a life that didn't make sense, just looking for a quiet place to start over. Now he found himself at the center of something much bigger, participating in the healing of historical wounds and the preservation of a precious culture. When the ceremony was over, Joseph announced that the tribe would like to establish a permanent relationship with Thomas and his estate. They proposed to transform part of the ranch into a cultural center where native traditions could be taught and preserved. Thomas accepted without hesitation, realizing that he had found his true purpose. The following months brought profound changes to Thomas's life and the region. The cultural center attracted visitors interested in learning about Native American history. Students, researchers, and respectful tourists came to participate in workshops on traditional crafts, natural medicine, and desert survival techniques. Cedar Ridge began to bloom in unexpected ways. Restaurants offered dishes inspired by native cuisine. Local artists collaborated with members of the tribe to create unique pieces. Prejudice and fear were gradually replaced by curiosity and mutual respect. Thomas found in his friendship with Joseph and Mary Crescent Moon something he never knew he was looking for. They became not only friends, but a chosen family that transcended cultural differences. They spent entire afternoons talking about philosophy, nature, and the mysteries of human existence. One afternoon, almost a year after the discovery of the objects, Thomas was walking around the property, observing the improvements that had been made. Small adobe huts for visitors, a garden with native medicinal plants, and marked trails that led to the most beautiful spots in the surrounding desert. Joseph approached, carrying a small but beautifully carved stone figurine. He explained that the tribe had decided to present Thomas with a personal guardian, a piece created especially for him by one of the most respected artists in the community. The statuette represented a coyote, a symbol of adaptability and wisdom in native culture. Thomas held the statuette carefully, feeling its symbolic weight. He had bought an abandoned barn for $1 and discovered that some things in life are priceless. True friendship, respect for the traditions of other peoples, and the satisfaction of making a positive difference in the world were worth far more than any material wealth. The wind from the west blew gently between the planks of the barn, but now the sound was not melancholy. It was a song of celebration, of shared stories and friendships that lasted beyond differences. Thomas smiled, watching the sunset paint the desert with gold and red colors, knowing that he had found exactly where he belonged. Some lands actually carry more than dust and forgotten memories. They carry opportunities for healing, growth, and human connections that transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. And sometimes it all starts with the courage to dig a little deeper than expected. If this story of friendship and discovery touched your heart, you'll love our other Wild West tales that show how small choices can transform entire lives. Our channel is dedicated to bringing authentic narratives about ordinary people who have found purpose and meaning in the Badlands of the American West. Each story is carefully researched and told with the respect these traditions deserve, exploring universal themes such as friendship, redemption, and the search for a place in the world. Subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our weekly adventures through the wild heart of the West, where there's always a valuable lesson waiting to be discovered.